Have you ever reacted to something and afterwards thought, why did I react like that? Or felt a weight you just couldn't name? Maybe you've come across the word trauma and thought, is that me? Or maybe you've tried to explain something to your partner and just couldn't find those words. Well, this episode is for you, and honestly, it might be for the person sitting next to you too. Today on Damn Parenting, we're breaking down what trauma actually is, in plain language, no jargon, and it's because understanding it might be the thing that helps you finally understand yourself, or gives you the words to explain something to someone you love. Hit play, and maybe send this to someone else who needs it. Welcome back to Damn Parenting. I'm your host, Eva. So here's something I want you to think about for 1 second. The word trauma. How does that land for you when you hear it? Does it feel like it belongs to you? Does it feel like it belongs to someone else? Someone who might have gone through something bigger, harder, more dramatic than your story? Because the thing is, trauma has become one of the most searched, most talked about words in mental health. And that's generally a good thing. But the conversation is growing faster than our understanding of it. And when a word gets used everywhere, it can start to feel like it only applies to the most extreme or the most visible versions of pain. So today, we're going to go back to the basics. What is trauma? Like really? Not the clinical sense, but in the way that might make you go, oh, that's what that was. We're also living in a moment where we're more overstimulated and more under-rested than possibly any generation before us. And if you're building a life here as an immigrant, that's genuinely hard. The mental health care system isn't always meeting it. Here in the Netherlands, over 50,000 people are currently waiting longer than 14 weeks for mental health treatment. Some even wait years. So if the therapy is feeling out of reach, information isn't. And that's what this show is for. Before I bring on today's guest, let me give you 5 things that count as trauma, just real things and things that might be yours. Moving here, even by choice, and finding that the grief of leaving your language, your community, your identity, it just doesn't go away just because this is a beautiful place. Or giving birth in a foreign country, in a system with different norms and possibly in a different language, and probably without your family nearby, and just being expected to get on with it. And we all know the growing up with a parent who wasn't emotionally available, not cruel, just wasn't quite there, never fully seen, never quite enough. Navigating illness, your own or someone else's, without fully speaking the language of the doctors or the paperwork. Or just being a capable, intelligent adult who is regularly reduced to simple sentences because Dutch is not your language. The slow indignity of it, accumulating quietly over years. Trauma isn't always what you see in films. Sometimes it's quieter than that, and sometimes it's you. Today, I'm going to be bringing in someone who is going to help us understand this clearly, warmly, and without jargon. She's a clinical psychologist and a trauma therapist, and an immigrant herself. Her name is Adina Petre. Adina, welcome to Damn Parenting.
Hi, Eva. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It is a pleasure to be discussing with you about such an important topic.
So before we get into it, can you just tell people a little bit about who you are and how you ended up in the Netherlands and why trauma became your focus?
Sure. I'm originally from Romania. That's where I was born and raised back in the day where Romania was still under dictatorship. So technically, I know trauma since before I was born. I also happen to have been studying it as a clinical psychologist. I was supposed to work in a clinic, in a mental health facility, but I was a rebellious student. And when I got there and I saw that clinical work was about managing symptoms, not addressing the root cause, I became curious. And that's when I discovered trauma. So I immigrated in the Netherlands about 16 years ago. And I started studying at the biggest institutes in Europe about psychological trauma and how it creates mental health symptoms that we're only addressing at a superficial level.
Wow, that's I feel like I definitely have the right person here. So we throw the word around quite a lot, what is trauma? And I think it's really both good and a little confusing. So I really want to just start here. So Adina, with all your professionalism, with all your education, what is trauma really?
I like to go back at the etymology of the word, and the definition itself comes from the ancient Greek language, where trauma means wound. So in psychological terminology, it's a wound of your psyche. It's a pain or a hurt that hasn't been resolved yet. And this is something that happens when we are confronted with an event that is overwhelming for our psyche to process fully in the moment. So what stays behind you, when we say trauma in psychology, we don't mean just the event itself. We look at what stays behind you in your body, in your memory, in the way you process and interact with the world. That's what trauma is an uninterrupted, natural capacity of processing something that's big and overwhelming.
And how do you explain trauma to someone who says, I don't think I have trauma?
Oh, this is one of those difficult things where, as a clinical psychologist, sometimes I feel like I could be perceived as a sadist. In my experience of working with people for 15 years now, when somebody makes that claim, I sit down with them and within 10 minutes, somebody's going to bring up tears in their eyes because probably for the first time I explain to them what trauma is and what isn't, and they uncover that they actually have something, but they never thought about it as being traumatic.
Okay. I don't want to sit in a room with you then, I guess. So I'm sure a lot of people have heard the body keeps the score. It's been going around now for a few years. So can you explain to us, can trauma really live in the body and what does that actually look like?
That's also very difficult to explain to people because technically I work with something that's invisible, the psyche and consciousness. We don't have a physicality for them yet. The only thing we know right now, at this moment in 2026, when we are speaking about this, is the fact that we do have a nervous system and we do have physiological responses to life, both outside of us and our internal experience, right? So when I'm being, for example, confronted with this overwhelming event, what I was saying earlier, my body, my nervous system will have a physiological response to it. Maybe it will increase a little bit my heart rate. Maybe it will tighten up my chest a little bit and I'll have a bit of difficulty breathing because I'm confronted with something so overwhelming and so big. Palms will get sweaty. I will start feeling a little bit jittery. So my body will constantly have a reaction to the overwhelming event that I'm experiencing. And this is the simplest way I can describe knowing that trauma is experienced by your body as well, not just by your psyche. And when we say that trauma stays in the body with the necessary air quotes, what we're talking about is the fact that our brain remembers experiences that were overwhelming, and it kind of creates a database that is trying to predict the future based on those previous experiences. So if I had a negative experience with a person looking a certain way, I will have that memory imprinted and coded, and then I will develop maybe even a phobia of certain people looking a certain way, and that will make me want to avoid them. But that's exactly what trauma does. It alters your perception. So we want to address it because otherwise it feels like you don't have the freedom to live as authentically as you can in this world, feeling safe at the same time.
And I do want to distinguish here because some people will say it's not really trauma. I just, I had a bad experience. Can you actually explain what the difference between a hard experience and a traumatic one could be?
I think the major differentiator is the fact that within a major or a difficult experience, or while we're going through a prolonged period of stressful exposure, we have the capacity to go back to baseline. Whereas after trauma, that capacity is no longer there. Trauma alters your identity, alters who you are. You start behaving in ways that you didn't behave before. You start having fears or doubts that you didn't have before. And that's also why it's so pervasive in a way, and it's so like it sneaks under your door and it catches you by surprise, and this is also why I really want to help as many people as possible to work on these and overcome these, because I feel like trauma sometimes it's a bit of a thief that steals your peace of mind. It steals chunks of your authentic self, which the good news is you can recover from.
Well, I'm glad to hear. One of the things I really wanted to unpack though today was because I hear people say it a lot is that the big T and the little t. And I think a lot of people hear trauma and always think that's not me. I didn't go through anything really bad. Can you actually open this up a little bit? Like, what's the real risk of only recognizing the big T, as it were?
I'm going to make the distinction between these two, and I'm going to add a third layer because I think it's really important, especially in today's context. So we have big trauma, the obvious suspects that most people know, and actually how we got to starting trauma in the first place. It was through PTSD that soldiers in the wars experienced. They used to call it shell shock, then they started calling it PTSD. So the big T trauma, which most people recognize, are these war, massive violence, abuse, serious accidents, major losses, displacement, and so on. The second one is the little t, which most people get to find out when they come in therapy. And they are about all the things that we didn't have, that we should have received, like a safe, regulated parent that was there for us, to see us, to nurture us, to not criticize us. Or experiencing the safe space of coming home after you've been bullied at school and not be overlooked or minimized in your experiences as a young person experiencing the world for the first time. It's also about not feeling understood, so that loneliness feeling, that solitude deep in your soul, that you feel like nobody understands you and you're alone in the world. That is also a little t trauma. And being exposed to things that were too overwhelming for your little psyche to process, that's also a little t trauma. Because in that moment, you don't have, as a child, for example, you don't have the neurological capacity to understand that reality that's being portrayed in front of you. And you don't have the comfort of a safe, regulated adult that can guide you through that experience. So that also counts as trauma. And last but not least, never quite feeling safe to be fully yourself, constantly having to negotiate which part am I giving up now in order to please or to belong or to integrate or to appease the space that I'm currently in. Those are also things that are considered trauma. And the third variable that I wanted to introduce, as I said, especially valid in today's world, is something that is called vicarious trauma. When we, in this space that we are now living in, we are safe, but the world around us isn't, because there's war going on right next door, because there are atrocities committed right now. And that's something that we are exposed to. It's like, you know, that description where you see a car crash happening and you don't want to look at it, but you're looking at it and this stains you, this traumatizes you. That is vicarious trauma. So right now we are being exposed to that because we open the news and we don't have a choice what the headlines are jumping in our faces. So that's the third one that I wanted to mention today.
That's kind of blown me a little bit there because, yeah, back in COVID era, I actually took off all my news apps off my phone because I just realized you're constantly bombarded with that. So I've learned a new terminology, I guess, today. So if we look at little t a little bit more, how does little t show up in our daily life in ways that we may not expect?
The simplest way to identify it is how it shows up in your relationship dynamics, because this is how actually trauma imprint starts very early on. When parents have unaddressed trauma, they pass on through a certain set of behaviors and through a certain level of emotional attachment to their children certain states of the nervous system. So if we have an anxious mother, for example, she might show up in the relationship with her firstborn child as overprotective, over anxious. And of course, out of loving that child and wanting the child to be safe, this mother might imprint some interdictions in the child's life, like you shouldn't explore the world as freely as you naturally want as a child. So inadvertently, she will create these little micro tears in the child's autonomy and in their psyche, and subconsciously pass on the knowledge that the world is not safe. So you might end up with an adult that is, for example, afraid of traveling by themselves or afraid of engaging in plain conversation in a new group, in a new setting, developing a sort of social anxiety because this was not modeled for them and because the subliminal message was the world is not safe. So that's one way. And the other way is, for example, if you grow up with such a traumatic imprint, it will show up in your couple dynamic. When you're naturally, as an anxious person, you would naturally gravitate towards a very independent person that keeps reinforcing that cycle. And that's another way in which it shows up. And another one, which is very overlooked, but brought up by a lot of my clients in conversations, in your dynamics at work. When you have a difficult dynamic with your work colleagues, with a manager that you feel they might be micromanaging you or not giving you sufficient support, usually that is also a relational imprint that you carry from early on in childhood, where maybe you learned that you had to be hyper independent in order to not bother a busy parent. So then you wouldn't dare to ask for help because you're thinking your manager expects you to handle everything together. And in time, left unaddressed, these kind of behaviors can lead, of course, to burnout in a workplace, can lead to having tensions in a relationship if a partner is too anxious and they're trying to exert some sort of dominance or control on the relationship, making the other person feeling suffocated by all of these presents. And last but not least, in our relationship with ourselves, if we don't have access from the beginning to our autonomy, if we are not credited with the deep trust of our caretakers that we can handle the world, we will have a wound that carries on through life of not trusting ourselves, second doubting ourselves, constantly debating our decisions, not liking who we are, discrediting our body, constantly criticizing our every choice. These are some of the ways in which trauma shows up in a relational field. And last but not least, it can also show up in symptoms of your body that you've been disconnected from and a little bit neglecting at times.
I'm kind of just stunned here with everything you're mentioning, to be honest. And I hope the listeners are really taking this in as well. This is why we're trying to keep this episode short, because there's so much to unpack here. And I think it's something I'm going to have to re-listen to one or two more times after recording this. So what can you say for someone who might always be saying, you know, other people had it worse off? Like, we always compare ourselves to other people and you think, I don't have that right.
Honestly, that's a defense. It's easier to compare yourself to somebody who has it worse off, and that's a defense, an automated defense of your psyche. So you're not purposefully trying to do anything here, but your psyche is trying to protect you from facing the pain of having it worse enough, because it's really not somebody had it worse than me and I had it better than others. I think one of the things that keeps trauma in place is people not having yet the capacity to look at themselves and just acknowledge, yes, that was deeply hurtful for me. You cannot heal what you cannot feel. So if you keep avoiding your repressed emotions of having suffered through something traumatic, either big T or little t, then you can't give yourself the chance to recover from it. And your nervous system cannot learn how to self-regulate, how to get back to functioning optimally.
Can I ask, for those of us born and raised in the 70s and 80s and maybe even 90s, when the parent says, you know, what are you complaining about? Other people have it worse off than you.
Sure.
Can you explain a little bit there on what that could have on us?
Yes. First of all, I do want to give this disclaimer that parents back then, they spoke the truth. We did have it better than them because they received way more trauma than we did. Let's not forget that in the 50s and the 60s, physical punishment was the norm. And parenting books back then used to say, don't hold your child, you're going to spoil them. So they grew up with a lot of violence and a lot of deprivation of emotional safety and connection. And some of them grew up in post-World War reconstruction of the world, which means that scarcity was actually the main thing in their households. So for our parents to put a roof over our head, to put clothes on our back, and to not be so strict with the parenting rules, for them it was an improvement. Back then they also didn't know that this was not good enough for us. So that's the challenge, right? When people come to therapy, I often tell them, we're not here to judge your parents. We are here to acknowledge what was true for you. And the truth for the most of us is that, yes, we might have had a good, safe roof over our heads. We might have had clothes on our back and books in our backpacks to learn and to develop and go to school. And at the same time, we also didn't have emotionally attuned parents that would take a genuine interest in who we are, We also didn't have parents who could honor and support our autonomous development, which is part of our nature. When children, for example, learn how to walk, you can hold them up, you can move their little legs as much as you want, but the decision to actually start walking is always belonging to the child. That is autonomy. That is when you see it at its finest. Is the same when they learn to pick up the spoon and learn eating, is the same when they make the inner decision to go potty when you've trained them. There's nothing you can do to modulate autonomy. It's such a natural thing. And unfortunately, for most of us, our parents had the idea that we need to be trained rather than supported in our development. And that is a wound that we all carry as a generation.
I have to keep turning my mic on and off because like I keep taking deep breaths and I'm keep having to take a moment listening to you when you're talking about this. So obviously, as you say, we're in 2026 and really living in this world, our lives basically are on a treadmill. It just keeps on going. Sometimes it speeds up, more to do, more to manage, more to feel. And very rarely is it ever going to slow down enough for us to catch up with ourselves. So where does trauma actually fit into this? Like what happens when we just keep running?
We burn out. The simplest, shortest answer is that we burn out. When our nervous system remains constantly activated into scanning our environment, getting used to the newness of everything that life is throwing at us and bombarding us with stimuli every single minute of every day, our nervous system, of course, is trying to do its best to keep up with everything, but we do get easily overwhelmed. We do get into burnouts. And if we're not very connected with our body, we do develop symptoms of physical chronic illnesses. We already have research on this. I'm not making stuff up, right? So we know that a body that lives in heightened stress for years on end will develop physical illnesses. And of course, all the other factors are contributing to this too. But I do believe that mental health has been so outcast in a way from the general healthcare conversation. And I really do believe that such conversations and such access can actually bring back that into the mix. And we can also, all of us collectively, start taking better care of ourselves from all points of view, because it's never mind versus body. It was always mind and body. We are a whole individual. We have a mind and we have a body, and they live together. And the more we refine how harmoniously they live together, the better I think we're going to be in the long term. And the better we get to set an example for the next generations. Because, newsflash, in case you didn't know this, just think back in your childhood, you never did anything your parents told you to do. You always ended up doing what your parents showed you. So, parents who are, you shouldn't be smoking, but they're smoking, what's going to happen? You're going to pick up smoking in your rebellious teens and so on, right? So naturally, this is also something for people who are either parents already or contemplating to become parents. If you constantly tell your child that they should be tidy and clean up the room, but you are not doing that, they're not going to learn it. They do what you show them, not what you tell them. So when it comes to taking care of our health, mental health, learning how to name our emotions, learning how to rest, how to pause before reacting, therefore giving us a chance to respond and not to react, that's what children learn. So we can model that for them by slowing down ourselves, by paying attention, and by solving our trauma, which hopefully and ideally we don't want to pass on to them as such a heavy baggage that was passed on to us.
I'm just laughing there because you said, we were modeled by our parents. Well, I can definitely tell you my parents weren't modeling any raves to me when I was going as a 12-year-old out to raves. They definitely never showed me that part, but that was, I guess, my way of expressing myself. Yeah. Can you actually share what are the signs someone has actually been in survival mode for just too long?
I want to first explain a little bit what survival mode is, because I also feel like it's one of those things that people throw around. And survival mode is basically what your psyche naturally does when you have been confronted with trauma. It creates these coping mechanisms, as they're more popular, let's say, that are not conducive to general health. So when you pick up smoking because you're stressed, or when you go raving because you're maybe rebelling against your parents, when you're overeating because sometimes that helps you manage your emotions, when you're gambling, shopping, doing any kind of addictive behavior. And by addictive behavior, I mean something that has a negative impact in your life that you cannot stop. That's something that you kind of can notice that trauma is present in the background. I often describe trauma as this invisible puppeteer that is pulling your strings, or it creates this imagery in which you feel like you're the spectator to your life but not necessarily the lead actor, or you're not driving the car but you're strapped in the back seat and you're like, who is this person that's doing all of these things? It looks like me, it sounds like me, but this is so weird because I don't fully back this behavior, or I don't fully understand it. So those are some of the indicators that you're living in survival mode. And survival mode, let's not forget, it's a protective mechanism always. Most people come to therapy and they're trying to dismiss survival. They're like, I don't want to do this behavior ever again. But I invite people, when you're identifying a survival strategy or a survival mechanism at play, my invitation is to gently inquire within yourself, what is this behavior protecting me from? What is this behavior trying to soothe for me? Because I feel like these are some of the most important questions that can actually help us connect with ourselves rather than further disconnect and create a big gap between our authentic self, our needs, and our survival strategies. So, survival strategies were necessary for us to overcome those overwhelming moments in our life, to cope maybe with the solitude of being overlooked or neglected by our parents. But right now, if they're taking over control of our life and we feel like we can no longer reel them back in, I think it's worth looking at and learning, what is this behavior trying to protect me from? What is this behavior trying to help me not feel as intensely as I fear I might not be able to cope with? That's where I would say the turning point lies in trauma recovery.
And can you explain at what point does just getting through it actually just start to cost us?
Every single day. Every single day, every single minute in which we are not connecting with ourselves but are trying to push through and overlook ourselves, we're actually just reenacting the trauma we grew up having. If you grew up not being seen or listened to, then you don't make space for yourself right now to look at yourself, to spend time with yourself, to maybe journal for the sake of learning how you are as a person now. If you grew up with much criticism, chances are you have internalized that, and that negative committee in your head does not shut up. And it shows up every single time. When you look at yourself in the mirror, scoping for your flaws. When you look in your kitchen, you're like, ugh, I'm such a slob, instead of just saying, I'm a bit tired and overwhelmed. This is a bit much to me, you know? So these are some of these ways in which it keeps showing up for us. And what it costs us is our peace, is our healthy connection with ourselves. We're not supposed to live in this dissociation from ourselves in which we perceive ourselves as an enemy to ourselves. We're supposed to be wholesome, self-regulated, connected individuals that are okay to stay in our body, that we feel good, that we like life and experiencing life. We're made for living. So we might as well try to get to a point where we enjoy it.
Well, we wanted to keep this as a foundational block, as it were, as
Yep.
we are going to keep talking every month about the next thing and the next thing when it comes to trauma. So in future episodes, we'll go into specific types, what they look like, how to recognize them, maybe even what helps. But it's also so impactful, everything you just said there about generational and how all of us now as parents are saying to ourselves, we want to break the cycle or we want to do better because we should be able to do better now that we're more aware.
Yes.
So Adina, thank you so much, genuinely.
Thank you so much for having me, Eva. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to our next episodes where we unravel bits and pieces about trauma.
I had to take a lot of breaths there as you spoke.
It's good that you had to take some breaths deep in, because that means your body and your nervous system were doing its job. When you were confronted maybe with some sensitive information that touched upon something in you, your body was assimilating that and it was just regulating you through the process. So good job.
Well, I think this is a conversation a lot of people needed to hear too as well today. So I hope whoever's listening, maybe you took a deep breath there as well. And that's basically what today's episode really is. It's really about permission. It's permission to call something what it is, permission to not have to have it all figured out, and permission to be somewhere on that treadmill that isn't quite fine, but to know that it is human and it does also make sense. And you don't have to have the dramatic story just to deserve care. Your experience is real because it happened to you, and that is enough. If something has landed for you today, like it has with me, just sit with it. You don't need to do anything right now, but noticing is already something. Adina is going to be back here with us next month and for the coming months, because we are going to be taking one piece at a time. As I said, the foundational blocks, and we are going to go a little deeper each time. So each episode is a new layer, a new angle, and hopefully more language for things that you might already be feeling, but just didn't have the words for yet. So take care of yourselves this week in whatever way is actually yours. I'm Eva, this is Damn Parenting. We'll speak to you next week.